Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is called The Future of Meetings and Events in a Post-Pandemic World. Before we get started, a little background. This webinar is actually based on research that we did with Cvent, so I would like to thank them for their support. They've been a tremendous partner. We've done a number of studies with them, and you probably know if we didn't have partners like Cvent, most of our research would not be possible. So we're really grateful for their support. I'd also like to introduce my co-presenter, Kelly Kopeck. She's with Cvent. She's a product marketing manager, and we're really excited to have her share her insights. So welcome, Kelly. Okay, with that, a little bit about the study. The study is based on a survey that we did in the US and Canada, where we went out and we surveyed people who are at least a little involved with planning meetings at their company. The topic was corporate meetings and what they'll look like coming out of the pandemic. And we looked at a couple different things. The first one is virtual and hybrid. I think it's obvious that these types of meetings have increased because of the pandemic, but we wanted to put some numbers behind it. So we asked people, how many of these meetings were you doing in 2019 before the pandemic, and how many are you doing currently? But that's not the only thing. We also wanted to see how our respondents view these meetings. Do they think these meetings are effective, and how are they managing them? And Kelly will share some tips and best practices for managing hybrid meetings. So that's the first thing. The second thing is meetings management. And we asked a bunch of different questions, but one of the big things that we'll talk about today is meeting approvals. So do companies have a formal process that you have to go through to get permission to hold a meeting? And what does this process look like? And who's involved in deciding if it's safe to hold a meeting? And then the last thing that we asked about is event technology. So planners have a lot of different technology that they use, and they use this before the pandemic, but we wanted to see if they're thinking about using it differently today. So that's an overview of the study. The methodology, I mentioned this earlier, we did an online survey of our members and contacts in the US and Canada. And to qualify for this survey, you had to say that you're at least a little involved when it comes to planning, organizing, or overseeing meetings and events at your company. We did this back in February. We had a response rate of 5.5%, and 106 people finished the entire survey. Okay, so let's talk about some of the results and what did the study find? And the first thing that I want to talk about is virtual and hybrid. And we wanted to see if the number of these meetings has changed because of the pandemic. And what we did was we asked about 3 different types of meetings: in-person, virtual, and hybrid. And we also asked about 3 different years: 2019, 2020, and 2021. And we asked respondents to tell us how many of the different types of meetings did their company hold, or do they expect it will hold, in each of these 3 years. And we had text boxes where you could enter a number, and then we averaged these out, and you could see the averages here. And I guess there's a couple things that sort of stand out. The first one, and this is really obvious, but the number of in-person meetings has really gone down. If you look at the left of your screen, on average, respondents say their company held 788 in-person meetings in 2019 before the pandemic. Last year, this number was only 150. And I would imagine that most of these were in January, February, and March, before the world really shut down. And then we also asked, how many in-person meetings do you expect your company will hold this year, 2021? And the average number is 25. But one thing to keep in mind, this is an average. And a lot of people, 36% of respondents entered a 0. So 36% do not expect their company will hold any in-person meetings this year. But the silver lining with this, 64% did not enter a 0. So 64% expect their company will hold at least one in-person meeting this year. And the other thing about this, we did this back in February, and the number of cases has really gone down since then. So I would imagine there's a ton more optimism about in-person meetings. And we've heard this anecdotally, that companies are starting to plan a lot of meetings that they didn't think they would be able to. So if we ask this again, I bet it would be a very different story. So that's the story with in-person. What about virtual? And if you look at the middle of your screen, 2019, before the pandemic, respondents only say their company held 32 virtual meetings on average. Last year, this went up to 125. So that's a pretty big jump. It's a 290% increase in the average number of virtual meetings. And I think this is obvious, but I would imagine that a lot of the meetings that were supposed to be in person were switched to virtual instead, but not nearly all of them. So the average number of virtual meetings went up by almost 100, but the average number of in-person meetings went down by more than 600. So what this suggests is that most of the meetings that were supposed to be in person were just canceled outright, and only a fraction of these were held virtually instead. And then looking ahead to 2021, respondents expect their company will hold an average of 118 virtual meetings this year. And then the last one that we asked about is hybrid meetings. And Kelly will talk about this later, but if you don't know what this is sort of a mix between in-person and virtual, where you have some people that gather in person, but other people join virtually. And if you look at the right of your screen, before the pandemic, this was pretty limited. So on average, respondents say their company held 13 hybrid meetings in 2019. Last year, this was only 5, but I would imagine that's because these meetings have an in-person component, and you couldn't meet in person last year because of the pandemic. But looking ahead this year, respondents expect their company will hold an average of 23 hybrid meetings this year. And that might not seem like a lot, but it sort of is when you compare it to the number before the pandemic. And you'll be able to see that more clearly on the next slide. So really quickly, this next slide, this shows the same data as the last slide, but we're showing it differently. Instead of showing the averages, we broke it out into ranges. And the reason for this is the averages can sort of be skewed when you have a lot of extreme values. So let's say, a lot of people enter a 0 and other people enter 500. It's hard to see what the typical company is doing. So that's why we did this. If you look at the middle of your screen, this is about virtual. 2019, before the pandemic, only 51% of respondents say their company held at least one virtual meeting. Last year, 93% of respondents say their company held at least one virtual meeting. And this year, 94% expect their company will hold at least one virtual meeting. And then if you look at the right of your screen, this is about hybrid, and this is the one that's really interesting. 2019, before the pandemic, only 29% of respondents say their company did at least one hybrid meeting. Last year, 30% say their company did at least one hybrid meeting. But this year, 60% expect their company will do at least one hybrid meeting. So that's a really big increase. You're going from having less than a third of companies that were doing hybrid meetings to this year where 60% expect to do at least one. Okay, moving on. We're talking about virtual and hybrid, and we just looked at how the number of these meetings has changed. Now I want to switch gears and talk about how our respondents view these meetings. And we wanted to see if they feel virtual meetings are more or less effective than in-person meetings. We asked 2 questions about this. The first one is, how did you feel before the pandemic? And the second one is, how do you feel currently? If you look at the left of your screen, this is how people felt before the pandemic. And what we see here is a really strong preference for in-person meetings. 97% of respondents felt in-person meetings were much more effective or somewhat more effective than virtual meetings. And this includes 75% who felt they're much more effective. And then if you look at the right of your screen, this is how people feel currently. And what we see here is that a large majority still prefer in-person, but they've sort of warmed up to virtual. So 76% say that in-person meetings are much more effective or somewhat more effective than virtual meetings, but they feel less strongly about this. Only 32% say they're much more effective. So, I look at this and I think the thinking has sort of evolved. Before the pandemic, a lot of people felt in-person was the gold standard and you shouldn't do anything else. But you look at it now, people still say in-person is the gold standard, but they've warmed up to virtual. So I would predict, in-person is going to make a huge comeback, but virtual will still be part of the mix because people tried these during the pandemic. They had a fairly positive experience. And they sort of, felt that, these meetings are effective in some cases, when you can't meet in person for whatever reason, you don't have the budget, that sort of thing. It's definitely better than nothing. And then I'm going to turn it over to Kelly and we're going to talk about hybrid. But really quickly, we had a question here. How did we define meetings? So what size and number of attendees? And we didn't define it based on size, but I think we had something in the survey that said, we're talking about, like actual meetings and not like, a team meeting that you would have at the office where you're meeting like on a regular basis with your boss or something like that. It has to be like a meeting. It could be internal or external, but it has to be like an actual meeting that involves like planning. So I'll turn it over to Kelly and she's going to talk about hybrid meetings.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. And thank you to GBTA for having CVent on this project. We're really happy with some of the data that we can present to you all, really helping our industry understand kind of what the future looks like. So as Mark said, I'm going to jump into this next section on hybrid events, which is really an evolving event type. And CVent is learning more from our customers and audience every day on this type of event. And Mark already kind of shared some of these stats, but I wanted to dive into some of the hybrid findings from the survey. So it was great to see that early on this year, 2/3 of planners polled, they're interested in holding more hybrid meetings. And as Mark said as well, my guess is if we conducted this survey right now, the number might be even higher because in-person is coming back and we have reaped the benefits of virtual and that expanded audience. So hybrid kind of makes sense for the right now and for the future. Hybrid events are a trend that we really don't see going away, and we think they're here to stay. So I want to move on to some of the additional hybrid data that we found during the study. We specifically asked about multi-venues, and GBTA's survey results found that over 30% of the respondents were looking for multiple venues to accommodate their hybrid meetings. And this makes a lot of sense to me because for those attendees who are interested in attending an event in person, organizers can kind of set it up so they're smaller, more regional events, and that gives attendees, more convenient travel options and makes it easier to plan from a safety standpoint. We know smaller meetings are easier and safer to put together. So even with multiple venues, several audiences can be connected in two experiences at that one shared event. And that's really what we're talking about with hybrid. And I'm going to take you through some of our CVent definition of kind of what a hybrid event looks like and what this new event landscape looks like altogether. And it's tough because a hybrid event can mean something different to every single organization. And it can really mean something different to the planners within that organization. So it's really hard to define what exactly is a hybrid event because there are so many different levels and definitions, right? So this is kind of how CVent is thinking about this emerging hybrid event type. A hybrid event is an event where part of the audience is in person at a venue or multiple venues, as we just discussed, and part of the audience is virtual. So the ratio of one audience type to the other doesn't really matter. You can have a higher percentage of virtual or a higher percentage of in-person attendees, as long as the event experience is created to benefit both or all audiences. And planners have reported that their biggest concern with the hybrid event type is creating an optimal event experience for both audiences. So that's really key that the event owner, they must develop and deliver content and other aspects of the event to create that compelling and engaging experience for both audiences. You can see on the right-hand side, these are some of the key hybrid considerations that that CVent is including, and that's attendees being in multiple locations. So your virtual audience could be located all over the world. Your in-person audience could be in one location, or they could be in multiple locations. And then attendees, they may mix in both the content and networking, but they're not required to mix. It can be two separate content streams. Event content doesn't have to differ, as I just said, for in-person and virtual attendees. It can be consumed at the same time. But the most important part is that each experience should be optimized for the audience. So a great example of this right now is at CVent, we're putting together our hybrid CVent Connect in Las Vegas in early August. So we're wondering, how do we fully optimize the content we're producing for the in-person audience and the virtual only audience? Because virtual attendees, they don't want to necessarily sit through that long session. And we know that in-person attendees are more engaged because they're in person seeing the speaker and they're not having that virtual fatigue with the longer sessions. So the virtual audience is really looking for that like bite-sized content with more dynamic production, think sports broadcasts or late night talk shows. So we really have to adjust our strategy for each audience to accommodate what they expect and what they need for an engaging experience. And then finally, the last one, attendees could have different motivators, right, for participating in the event. So you have to kind of find out as the event organizer what those drivers are, and then set the strategy and approach for the overall event design. So that's kind of how CVent is looking at it. And this is really the emergence of hybrid events results in this explosion, especially as the planner, of all these potential event formats that you can set up. And they're probably different than event formats you've set up in the past. So there's a lot to organize and put together. So CVent's intent here is not to design a specific one format for a hybrid event. It should really be based on your organization, your unique goals, and your business and audience objectives. So that's really the goal of kind of putting together this format. So we want to talk about kind of what you get with a hybrid event. What are the benefits? So the decision to host a hybrid event comes with some very obvious benefits. First and foremost, we all know from the year of virtual, the exponential reach, or what we call at CVent is the hybrid multiplier effect. So backed by industry benchmarks and CVent's own customer and internal event data, we can assume that by going hybrid, customers can see anywhere from 3 to 10x the number of in-person only events. This is just a quick and easy example demonstrating that fact. When we compare an in-person only event that was pre-pandemic times in 2019, you can see on the left-hand side, and then it was pivoted to a virtual only event hosted in 2020 during the pandemic, and what's possible when we combine the benefits of both to achieve the maximum impact, which you can see on the right-hand side. In the model, we make the assumption that in-person attendance remains a little bit lower in 2021 as we continue to reach recovery, but in 2022, which we're kind of talking about as the golden age of events, and we predict growth in both in-person and virtual audiences, you could see the greatest number of return there. We're also kind of putting together the 6 foundational pillars of a hybrid event. And these will help you overcome challenges and are really key to your success in putting together a hybrid event. The first is marketing. So designing a single event agenda with distinct program offerings, and that starts with an audience-centric approach to marketing, targeting and delivering the right experience to the right audience. The venue is key in any hybrid event. You want to partner with venues to ensure a safe experience, and you want to find venues that help you navigate any of the needs you need from a production standpoint and an AV standpoint. And even creating a list of preferred venues that kind of align with your organizational goals and your safety playbooks is really helpful in starting to enter into in-person and hybrid events. From a content standpoint, another pillar, you really need to master that content strategy. We kind of talked about the importance of the right content for the right audience. And emphasize the production experience and execution to your audience. You need to foster community. You need to engage your in-person and virtual audiences individually. And you also want to give them a shared experience, if possible, across the key pieces of where they can intersect and where that makes sense. And then second to final, the sponsors and exhibitors. You want to create more diverse sponsor and exhibitor packages by delivering valuable opportunities, both in person and virtual, with options for either. And then finally, the last thing we talk about is insights. You want to make sure you're measuring both the in-person and the virtual components, so you're getting that full picture of the event impact and the ROI based on all of the audience engagement points for both of those things. And then the commonality across these 6 pillars is that technology has really become the foundation for which your entire event strategy rests upon. So you'll need to make considerations for how it can be best leveraged in every step of your strategic planning conversations. And that kind of concludes our in-depth look at hybrid, and we're going to move on to meetings management and some of those shifts in strategies and that the organizations that we polled had to make because of the pandemic, and we're going to kind of look into what those were. So the first bit of interesting data that we'll take a look at today is that the anticipated recovery time based on the size and complexity of the meeting was very interesting. Respondents agreed that simple meetings, and we defined a simple meeting in this scenario as 50 attendees or fewer, that simple meetings will lead the recovery. Over half of the participants that we polled thought that simple meeting programs will be fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels within 1 year's time. So that would be by the start of next year. While just over half of our respondents agreed that large events and conferences will take a bit longer, 1 to 2 years, to recover to those pre-pandemic levels. So what we found is simple meetings are really leading the recovery. And we're actually seeing that through our CVent data as well. We're seeing a larger volume than average of simple meeting RFPs sent through our venue sourcing platform over the past few weeks specifically. And with GBTA providing the industry with great stats always, I wanted to remind the audience just what the pre-pandemic levels were for simple meetings. So in 2018, GBTA conducted a global study on how companies manage simple meetings, and they found that 50% of all corporate events are considered simple meetings. So with this stat from pre-pandemic times, simple meetings are, a high level of all the meetings that are planned. So if simple meetings recover the quickest within the time frame that the survey respondents thought, that means that 50% of event programs will be up and running within 1 year, which is really, really positive to think about. And simple meetings represent a large volume of meetings, and we know that they're probably, and they are, coming back first. So a pre-pandemic stat again that GBTA found is that 42% of respondents do not track small meeting expenditures. And it's arguably, I would say, more important than ever to take a look at your strategy for simple meetings, specifically simple meetings of all the meetings types. And hopefully you didn't have to learn this the hard way when the pandemic hit, but a lot of the meetings that you may have had scheduled for 2020 didn't happen. So by creating a workflow that allows you to track who is booking, where they're booking, when they're booking, you'll be better covered from the simple meeting standpoint. And we're not just talking about budgeting, we're talking about risk mitigation and knowing just for certain who has booked simple meetings and if they're in policy, if they're following safety protocols, and just making sure you're covered from a liability and risk mitigation standpoint for your organization. So back to the survey, we asked respondents what percentage of their company's in-person meetings are visible on a central calendar. And only 30% of respondents said most or all of their company's meetings are visible. So that leaves the majority stating that no meetings to some meetings are visible. By having that extremely limited view of your total in-person event program, you're completely exposed to risk and liability. So using the pandemic, we talked about as a valuable lesson of what could go wrong if you don't have insight into all of your meetings. We can use this moment in time to kind of set up that process and create strategies to limit the exposure of potential risks of not having visibility. And we asked a little bit more about the meetings management processes that you all have in place. 60% of the respondents do have a formal process to request to hold in-person meetings. And a staggering 30% of you do not have any kind of process in place. And over half of those that do have the process in place tend to manually forward meeting requests for approval. So it's a very manual process. And we'll see in a little bit, there's a lot more people, players, stakeholders, and departments involved in decisions around meetings management right now specifically. So having that formal approach assisted by technology can allow for the proper management, approvals, and risk mitigation practices that are vital in this new world where in-person events are rebounding and they really require safety and visibility. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to Mark, and he's going to conclude some of our findings.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So moving along here, we just looked at how the different types of meetings will recover and what the expectations are for that. But we also asked about the purpose of meetings. And I'm pretty surprised by this, is that, respondents are saying that regardless of the purpose of meetings, they expect them to recover on a similar timeline. So 52% expect that meetings with external clients or prospects will fully recover within a year. And 51% expect that internal meetings will fully recover within a year. So like, let's say you're doing like a training for new hires or something, people expect that will recover too. And I'm a little surprised because these internal meetings are the ones that, have really switched to Zoom. But people are saying that they're going to do these in person as well. And I sort of wonder if the new trend of remote working, will persist after the pandemic. So, this is something that we've heard anecdotally is that, companies will give their employees more flexibility to work from home. And some of them have switched to remote work permanently. And how will that affect business travel and meetings? And one of the things that we've heard is that you'll have to do more like internal like team building exercises and that sort of thing. So like, let's say you have, people living all over the country, you might have an event every quarter where all of the team members travel to like a location, and they sort of do like bonding exercises, like get dinner together, work together and that sort of thing. So internal meetings will look different, and there'll be sort of a way to like bring a remote workforce together and build like a workplace culture when you're not able to do that, just by having people go to the office every day. Okay, moving on. Kelly, we were talking about meeting approvals, and you just showed that a lot of companies have a formal process for this. But who's involved in deciding if it's safe to have a meeting? If you look at the left side of your screen, these are the different stakeholders that are involved with this in the COVID-19 environment. And what really sticks out here is that a lot of people are involved. So, more than half of respondents say the C-suite is involved, more than half say the security risk department is involved, the HR department, the legal and compliance department. So there's a lot of people that work together to make a decision about whether it's safe to hold a meeting in the current environment. And it's really a complex process that involves a lot of different stakeholders. But then you look at the right of your screen, and we asked a similar question, but what we're asking here is who makes the final decision. So we only let people pick one. Out of all these different stakeholders, who has the most influence when making the final decision? And almost half say that it's the C-suite. So, we did this back in February, but it just shows you how seriously people were taking this. Half of respondents say that their company wouldn't let them hold a meeting without, the C-suite making the final decision about it. And, I think this is sort of a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge to convince the C-suite, that it's safe to hold a meeting, and then there's enough, value in it to justify the risk. But it's also an opportunity to show the value of your meeting program. This is something that maybe didn't used to be on the C-suite's radar, but now, like if the chief human resources officer or even the CEO has to sign off on your meeting, you can go to them and show them the value of the meeting that you're doing. That we expect this many clients to be there. We're hoping to get like this many sales leads and that sort of thing. And so, even when COVID goes away, the C-suite will remember that you do this meeting every year and say like, oh yeah, a lot of customers go there, and it's a really good like opportunity to showcase our products and that sort of thing. So I think it's an interesting opportunity as well. And sorry, here we go. Sorry about that. And then the last thing that we looked at is technology. And we wanted to see if respondents are interested in using technology differently because of the pandemic. And one of the things that we looked at is event diagramming software. If you don't know what this lets you create a room setup where you map out like where the tables will be and the chairs and the aisles and that sort of thing. And in the past, I think this was really about the attendee experience, but we wanted to see if our respondents are interested in using it for social distancing as well. And 49% are interested in using software to seat attendees based on social distancing guidelines. So, you use this software to make sure that the chairs are, 6 feet apart and the aisles are wide enough and that sort of thing. 49% are interested in using software to create socially distant room setups in compliance with local guidelines. So different localities have, guidelines on how many people can be in a room of a certain space, and you might be able to use this to make sure that you're following those guidelines. And then the last one, I think this is pretty interesting. 46% are interested in using software to go on virtual tours of potential venues. So, a lot of planners are working on events that are supposed to happen in the future, but they're not allowed to travel at the moment. So, let's say you're planning an event for next year, but your company has a policy where you're not allowed to travel for the next 3 months because of COVID. You might be able to go on a virtual tour of venues and pick one out that way, rather than visiting in person. And 46% are interested in this. Moving on, let's talk about some of the other things that you could do with technology. 59% are interested in replacing paper maps and guides with digital versions through the mobile app. And we asked about this and we were thinking about COVID, but this is also a sustainability issue as well. And we're hearing a lot more about that. And then I don't want to talk about all of these, but I think the last one is really interesting. Only 43% are interested in using event data for contact tracing. So let's say you have an event and someone goes to your event and becomes sick with COVID. You might be able to use data for contact tracing. So you can say this person attended these 5 sessions. Let's call everyone else who was in these sessions and tell them that they might have been exposed. But only 43% are interested in doing that. Okay, so that's all the content that we had. I want to quickly run through the profile of our respondents just to give you an idea of who took the survey. I mentioned earlier, to qualify for the survey, you had to be involved with meetings management. 26% of respondents were only a little bit involved with this, but the rest were somewhat moderately or very involved. Country, 86% of our respondents were based in the US, 14% Canada. And then meeting spend, I think we had a pretty good mix of small programs, medium spend programs, and large spend programs. So that's all the content that we had. Now we'll switch it to Q&A. And Kelly, the first question that came in is about virtual meetings. So, obviously we saw a lot of virtual meetings during the pandemic, but now that things are opening back up, are you seeing that there's still a strong interest in virtual meetings, or are people switching more to in-person and hybrid?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because 2020 was kind of the year of transitioning to virtual, and literally everything we did was behind this Zoom screen, and we're still kind of doing it a lot. So I wouldn't say we're seeing less demand for virtual. It's still very much at its peak, because that's just kind of what we're relying on and what we've become accustomed to in achieving our event goals. But we're definitely seeing more demand for in-person events, which this data really proves are coming back. What we're finding is organizations they're taking a look at their total event program, and before that might have been purely in-person events, and now they're kind of defining what that total event program looks like in a smarter way. They're looking at what are the event goals and what are the budgets? And then how do they align with a virtual format, a hybrid format, or an in-person format? So for example, it might make more sense to keep some of those events that were held in person in 2019 and then became virtual in 2020. It might make sense to keep them virtual in 2021 if you had success in that format in 2020, and due to budgets and the higher audience reach and different implications there. So it's really hard to kind of say what is the right approach for each organization, because it's an evaluation process that has to happen company by company. And unfortunately, probably at this point needs to be done multiple times a year because event formats and in-person regulations are changing all the time, right? So a good suggestion and what we do a lot at CVent is that we tend to poll and survey our potential audience or previous year's attendees to see what event formats they prefer. And then we can kind of go from there. Does it make sense then to have an in-person component? If they're fine with it being virtual, does it make sense to have in-person and virtual formats? Because there is demand for that face-to-face interaction. So long answer, but yeah, it's kind of case by case scenario, I would say.
No, that's really interesting. And I think another, element to this, obviously this was about COVID, this whole study, and that's what really sort of like brought people to doing virtual events, but right before COVID started, we heard all this buzz about sustainability. And that sort of ties into like virtual and hybrid as well. Just from the travel side, in the last year or two, a lot of companies came out with like specific goals where they're saying like, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030. And not always, but some of the time this has implications for travel where they come out with like a specific plan to do this. And they say like, we're going to cut emissions from business travel by 10%. And then, because of that, it might be harder to justify attending a conference, especially if it's just, for like your own like personal development or education. So it'll be interesting to see if that drives more people to do hybrid events as well, just to get people who are like worried, about like flying from Europe to the US to do an educational conference, if they can justify the carbon footprint of that.
Exactly. And it reminds me of this trend that we're seeing, not just with sustainability, but it's like purposeful travel and purposeful meetings. So really understanding what employees and organization wants and what would be the best benefit to the organization from that travel and meeting standpoint, and then presenting a business case to probably the C-suite to get approval on what the new format looks like to be the best benefit from a sustainability standpoint, from an employee satisfaction standpoint, and then meeting your event and travel goals. So it's all about being more purposeful with the way the program's set up and not just having a meeting to have a meeting because that's what you always did, right? So it's just kind of like this new trend forward and looking at a better approach.
Yeah, we've definitely seen a lot about that, and people are starting to use like tools to sort of like determine whether it's safe to travel and that sort of thing. Okay, another question about this, and this is a little different. So are event planners finding a need to include wellness breaks, like, meditation and yoga and exercise breaks when holding a meeting? And, are they doing this for in-person and virtual meetings or just in person?
We don't have specific data points around this. I could just tell you kind of from the CVent experience, what we're seeing. And I know with the majority of our internal meetings that, were held at Cvent, we had several countdown meditation breaks throughout content that kind of just said, do nothing or meditate. And it was this Zen kind of experience with music that really kind of helped you, okay, I have a break between the next content that I'm consuming virtually, and this time's for myself. So that's something that we really put a precedent on, especially with internal meetings. And then of course our own, wellness initiatives as well, just from the employee standpoint. With our Cvent Connect conference coming up in person, I know we're looking into that kind of on-site experience as well, giving the in-person audience several areas to kind of rest, recharge, meditate, recuperate, I guess do work if they want to do work. But it can be a lot, and we're seeing this with a lot of colleagues who are starting to attend in-person events. It could be a lot jumping right into face-to-face. So we completely acknowledge that it's exhausting to be completely social for several hours in a row, especially face-to-face. So we're incorporating a lot of that health and wellness and kind of environment to help you recharge and recuperate into an in-person component. So I think that will be something, at least for the short term, that we see be a trend throughout virtual and hybrid and in-person meetings.
Yeah, no, and we hear a lot about traveler well-being, and I could imagine that would extend to meetings as well. And then this is another really interesting question that came in. So, we're hearing a lot about like hybrid events, but what about, having the virtual components at different times? So let's say you're doing an in-person event here and it's also hybrid, but there's people in Australia, do they have to wake up in the middle of the night, or how do you accommodate that?
Sure, that one is very tough, because if it is truly a global event, there's no best universal time to hold your content. But we've been prioritizing our shared interactive content. So something like a live virtual networking event, we've been having that content at a mutually beneficial time to accommodate the most regions, right? So for example, this webinar is accommodating Europe and regions in North America being held at the time we have it. So if you have an event that really is reliant on the live experience and maybe that networking, have it at a time that accommodates the majority of your global audience. The glory with virtual content is that it will be available on demand. We usually keep our content on demand for at least a month, sometimes longer. So those in other time zones can conveniently consume that content at the time. We find that most of our virtual audience doesn't consume more than a few sessions actually at the live time, just because there's so many distractions. When you're behind the computer screen, you're going to start doing a separate project, take a call, do another meeting. So it's really not worth having all of those different virtual experiences at different times when that content is available on demand.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's even for in-person only events, the on-demand education sessions are a huge thing. I know, I go to our convention and I work in some education sessions, but I realistically can only see 5 of them. But then I might watch another 20 on demand. So, you can't be everywhere at once.
Exactly.
And then, I guess one more, and I guess this is really a challenge, and I'm not sure if, either of us can answer this, but meeting planners really have to look far into the future. So people are working now on an event that might happen, 9 to 10 months from now. but do we have any idea, like the people that are planning future events, if they're doing social distancing, like measures for events that are going to happen like in mid 2022, or do they even know yet?
Yeah, that we are seeing that regardless of when the event is happening, that planners are following the current local guidelines. The good thing about technology is, for example, we were talking about the event diagramming software. It's very easy to input or even automate what the local current regulations are in terms of distancing, say it's 6 feet, into your diagrams and your event setup, and automatically the event is socially distanced to what you need from the tables and chairs and setup standpoint. So it's easy to automate that process, especially if things change. We do see those current regulations still in being followed, and then really up to the decision makers, if it's not regulated by the local guidelines, if those policies are necessary from the organization standpoint. So really putting together that playbook, like what is safe to your organization? Do you follow those local guidelines, or do you have your own guidelines, right? So that's kind of what we're seeing. I don't know what the future will hold, but certainly technology can help with that, because it's this automated process of this is what we're following, input it, and you get the output of a safe event, whatever safety is to you.
No, that definitely makes sense. And, I would imagine that it's different from one company to the next, but there's guidelines that everyone has to follow, and it's important to be aware of that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the last question, Mark. So we're talking about the respondent profile of the survey results. Is there a segmentation per industry type, like pharmaceuticals or life science companies?
So, we have a standard question that we ask about, which industry that you're in, and that's included with the report. The challenge that we have is, we had 106 people take the survey, and we don't have enough respondents to do like, a really deep like industry breakout where we say like, this is what manufacturing companies are doing, and this is what like life sciences companies are doing, and like consulting companies. So unfortunately, we can't like break the data out by that. But if you want to see like who took the survey, we asked what industry their company is in. Okay, so that's all the questions that I see. So, if I don't see any more, really thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Kelly, for your time, and CVent for supporting the study. We really appreciate it. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.